I grew up in a family of 12 children, number 10 of the 12, parents that love Jesus. We grew up in the church. I gave my life to the Lord at a young age. I think I was 4 or 5 when I prayed a prayer with my dad, but that, was just the beginning of my introduction into faith, into knowing Jesus. I have a very distinct memory when I was 10 years old. I was at a YWAM, which is Youth with a Mission. It's a discipleship, massive mission space all over the globe. My sister, one of my older sisters, was graduating from the discipleship training school, and we had gone to her graduation. And at the end of their graduation, they actually put out a call for anyone that would like prayer if they felt called to the mission field. And at 10 years old, I'm not sure why, or I can only say that now that I believe it was the Holy Spirit compelling me, but I walked straight to the front and found myself in a circle of, 20 kids that were all teens, young adults. I'm guessing, because from my perspective, I was just looking up at all these tall people around me, and I immediately questioned, what am I doing here? Why did I come up front? I shouldn't be here. I was immediately insecure, but I was already there, and I didn't want to go back to my seat, so I just stayed. And there was a team of people that came and prayed over everyone in that circle. And from that moment, I really felt marked by the Lord and called by Him to be a full-time missionary. I don't think I really fully understood what that meant, but something in me just was set on being a missionary, going overseas. I didn't have any certain country in mind, but I just knew that I was going to go. So at 10 years old, we went back home to where I was, I grew up in New Hampshire, and went to church, and I pulled aside my 2 best friends at the time. So 3 of us 10-year-olds, I pull them to the front of the church after service, and I explained to them, God has called me to be a missionary, and I'm going to be a martyr. Now, I'm not sure where that part came in, but I also just had this feeling, this sense that I was going to give my life for the gospel. And at 10 years old, we were just very emotional. We were all crying together. Oh my gosh, like as if I was going to die the next day. But that really was what thrust me on this trajectory in my own memory of wanting to be a missionary and preparing myself for that. So, after high school, all my friends were going to university, and I had done really well academically in school. I got good grades, things like that. So it was kind of expected I would go to university, and I was applying to schools. I got accepted to several schools, got scholarships to a couple. And I was praying about it. I decided on this school in Ohio that had offered me a scholarship, and I was going to study world religion because I thought, well, I'm preparing to be a missionary. I should, learn about all the religions of the world so I can effectively preach the gospel. I was signed up, filling out my classes, all of that, when one evening the Lord spoke to me and said, you're not going to this university. You're not going to school yet. That's going to be put on hold. You will go to school later. And I didn't know what that meant at the time, but the Lord spoke to me that I'd be going to Street Life Ministries, which was a missions organization based in New York City. And my youth group had done some outreaches with them. I had led some teams there for a New Year's Eve outreach. I had gone to Brazil twice with them as a ministry. So I did have some relationship. The directors of the ministry had known my parents and my family for a very long time because our church supported this ministry. So it was a ministry that we had relationship with, that I somewhat knew from very short-term times with them on outreach. And I just knew at that moment as an 18-year-old, this is God speaking to me. I need to do this. And I kind of exploded. I remember at my father, because I felt like, as an 18-year-old, your perspective is very different. Looking back, I see differently. But I remember in that moment, I thought my dad was pressuring me to go to college and university. And so I exploded at him, kind of putting the blame on him. Oh, you've made me do school. It's just what you want, but God's calling me to be a missionary. I remember going back to my mom's house and talking with my mom about it. And she's very wise. She said, you need to call your dad. You need to apologize to him, first of all. And you need to ask him to pray with you about this decision, because he hears from God. And, I took her advice. I called him that evening. I apologized and I asked him to pray with me about it. And a week later, he told me he felt complete peace about me going to this ministry. So in September of 2005, my mom and my sister drove me to New York City and dropped me off at this ministry. And at the time, there were only a few staff there, and the staff who were there were much older than me. The next youngest was 24 years old, which felt like to me a huge age gap at 18 years old, which is funny because that 18 and 24, not that huge of an age gap, but we were just different personalities too. And I had a big friend group back in New Hampshire. I had tons of young people my age that loved Jesus, were running hard for Jesus. I had a wonderful church community at the time, and God sent me to this place that I didn't have friends. I didn't know anybody, just, the director and his wife from doing a handful of outreaches with them. And there was a 24-year-old, a 28-year-old, and a 40-year-old on staff. And I remember that first day, my mom and my sister got me settled in, and then they had to leave to drive back to New Hampshire. And I just sat in the room and cried. And it just hit me, oh my gosh, I've just left everything else behind. I've left my friends behind. There's no one my age. It's not some like trendy ministry location that everyone's wanting to go to, which at the time was the International House of Prayer or Bethel, or those were the two big ones at the time that people were going to for missions. And I went to Street Life Ministries, which was smaller and 3 staff who were older than me. And I remember in those first months of living there, I wanted to leave desperately. I struggled so deeply because, on the one hand, I was very passionate about being called to be a missionary, but I didn't realize how immature I really was and how little I actually knew. And I was being challenged very much in the day-to-day life in community living. And I was someone used to community living. I grew up in a family with 12 children. There was lots of community, lots of people around having to share the things and, share bathrooms. And that was not the difficult part. It was the relational community aspect that was very challenging for me, because I began to see stuff in me that was not like Jesus. And the director and his wife loved me enough to share things with me that were not like Jesus and places that I needed to grow. And it was extremely difficult. I didn't want to know those things. I felt like, they were pointing a finger at me. And so I wanted to point the finger back and excuse everything they said by saying, well, you have these issues and I see all these things. And so who are you to say anything to me? And God really was using that to work out some stuff in my life. I actually wrote a book called The Orphan Mentality, which goes into a lot of my story and how God transformed the way that I think through his love. And it goes through all of these, attributes that I was clearly walking in. I functioned like an orphan. I thought like one. I interacted like one. My relationships were so not completely unhealthy, but there was a lot of unhealth in them because of a lot of the mindsets that I had and thought processes and pride in my heart and immaturity. The list goes on. So I'm at this ministry. God's called me there. And this is the first time in my life where I'm really realizing there's a cost to my obedience, that God has called me to street life. I could have gone to college with everyone who would be my same age, lived in a dorm with people, and, seemingly had a blast. Like everyone says, you have a blast in university, college, so much fun. And I'm realizing, man, I'm here and I'm not having a blast. I'm being challenged. I'm being broken. Things are being exposed in my heart. And why am I doing this again? And every time I would come back to, he called me here. He wants me here for a reason. Jesus wants me here. And because I loved him enough and said, he was, even at that point in my life at 18, this was the beginning of this really realizing that the way that I love him is through action, not just words, not through singing, because I love to worship. I love to sing to the Lord. It wasn't just through these like feel good moments experientially, it was through my life being laid down in surrender to Him and recognizing that His way is better than my way and that I will say yes to anything He wants at any point in time. I will say yes to Him. And so this was like the very beginning part of that. And I had joined the ministry for 2 years. That was my commitment because the school in Ohio was going to put my scholarship on hold for 2 years. So I thought I'll come and do ministry. I'll be part of this organization for 2 years and serve, and then I'll go off and do university. God said it's going to be later. So this is what He must have meant. As I was coming toward the end of that 2-year period, I began to pray about it. Okay, God, is this what you want me to do? Because I wasn't just going to make my own decision. I really wanted to know that God was directing my path, that I was following Him in the things that He wanted me to do in my life, because my life is not my own anymore. It's His. And He loves me and has the best plan for me. So I went to pray about it. And I remember so distinctly the Lord saying, no, it's not time to leave. In fact, you're going to stay here until David, who's the director, until David says that it's time for you to leave. And you're going to have to trust me in that process. And I about had a panic attack. I'm 20 years old at this time. That 2-year period felt like an eternity already. For an 18-year-old, usually in our culture, long term is like 6 months, right? You go, yeah, I'm going long term, 6 months. And we know now as you get older, you're like 6 months is no time at all. It passes in an instant. But when you're 18 years old, it seems like a very long time. So 2 years of my life felt like an eternity, like I was giving up this massive chunk of my life for this. And now the Lord's saying, you're going to stay on indefinitely until someone else says it's time for you to go. And I thought David would never release me. I thought he was going to, want me to be the next director of street life, that I would be there forever. And I had this burning desire in my heart that God had placed there when I was 10 years old to be a missionary, to go overseas, to go to other countries, to live in other countries, to preach the gospel to the poor and the lost and the hurting, and to love just the least of these. I'm like, God, how am I going to do this? I can't make anything happen. And that was Him bringing me into just this further intimacy with Him, trust, where I could trust His leadership, His timing, and where I wasn't the one just making the decisions. I'd have to fully rely on God to speak to David when it was time for me to go. So I didn't tell David about this conversation because that would have ruined the whole process. I just said to him, the Lord is telling me that I'm going to stay on indefinitely. I don't have an end game. I don't have a time frame anymore. The Lord's just saying to stay. So I did. And it wasn't until over 6 years later, not 6 years later, I had been there 6 years. So over 4 years later, I knew it. I could feel it, like my time's coming. I really felt like the Lord was telling me I was going to go to Brazil. And we had done missions trips every year to Brazil with Street Life. They would go and serve at the YWAM base in Contagem. And so I had some relationships, a handful from those 2-week trips we would do every year. And obviously I didn't speak the language or anything like that, but I really felt like God was saying, Brazil's going to be your next step. I had had a couple of dreams about it. God was speaking, but there was nothing I could do. I knew that God was saying, had said to me, you're staying here until David releases you. So I just prayed about it. Okay, God, you're bringing this into my life. I think you're calling me to go to Brazil, so you're going to have to make this happen. And I remember distinctly this one day that David called me into his office. And I knew as I walked in, he had said he needed to talk to me after our staff meeting that morning. And I just had a knowing, okay, this is it. I think this is it. And we sit down and he says, okay, so are you thinking about leaving the ministry? And I just, I said, oh my gosh. He said, I've just been feeling this for a while. Is it time for you to go? And I began to share with him, oh, I'm feeling called to go to Brazil. And I think this is what God's calling me to do. And he fully released me in that moment. And we had a few conversations about, whether I'd stay with the ministry and be sent out from them. But God really directed even that transitional period where he gave me a picture of the chapter closing, like there was a turning of a page. As I was praying, I saw this picture of a turning of a page and the chapter ending, and the Lord spoke to me that my time at Street Life was done and that I was moving on to my next assignment.
What's up, everyone? Thank you for watching this video clip. If you liked it, check out more videos on our channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, get alerts for when we post new stuff, and we hope you stick around. God bless you guys.